Good evening, everyone, and welcome back. Tonight's tasting is going to be a little bit map heavy, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So this is a region that, well, I probably should have put off till later, but I really love the wines from here, and specifically I tasted this a little while ago, and I said I have to build a tasting around this because I love the wines so much. So we are going to go into the most dangerous of ground. We're going to go to Languedoc and Roussillon. Our first wine tonight will be the Domaine Reine, Juliette, Picpoul de Pinet, while I get us started and introduce the region. Hello, Hand. Lovely to have you back. Aaron?
Thank you.
No pumpkin spice beer, so we'll stop calling you Karen temporarily. We'll find a reason to continue later. So the Languedoc-Roussillon region is one of the three major southern regions of France. You have the Languedoc-Roussillon, you have Provence, and then you have the southwest. Let's bring up the map here. Ignore that, that was supposed to be a bookmark. So down here in the south, this is Languedoc and Roussillon, all down here. There's the southern Rhone here around Avignon. This is where Châteauneuf de Pape comes from, and we do count kind of Costières de Nîmes as being kind of the dividing line between Languedoc-Roussillon and the southern Rhone Valley. The two we're not going to talk about very much tonight, and I do want to mention our Provence. There's of course Provençal Rosé, which is the pink French rosé that we've all had 100 times, and just like when we did northeastern Italy and we didn't talk about Prosecco, we are going to cover this part of France and not talk about Côte de Provence rosé, because if you haven't had one, you probably should. It's kind of a reference rosé. Everyone should have it. And for me, they're very much of a muchness. I don't think I've ever had a Provence rosé that didn't taste exactly like a Provence rosé. I will briefly mention the region of Bandol, which is in Provence and makes big, chunky, rich, powerful, fiery reds in a very south kind of Mediterranean style. It's very, very good, but we don't actually have one in the store right now, which is a tragedy. The other southern region that we're kind of giving a pass is the southwest. We actually have tasted a Maturin when we did the Vine Box tasting. One of the wines, actually the most popular wine we actually tasted that night was a Maturin. And then you also have kind of just a little further north up here, you have Gaillac and Cahors. Cahors we actually did taste when we did the Gaudu Malbecs. One of the Gaudu Malbecs actually was from Cahors. And then finally we have Gaillac, which I have had in the store before. They're kind of like less interesting Bordeauxs that are grown a little bit warmer and have a little more fruit. That's really dismissing 1,000 years of winemaking history, but it's my channel and I'll do what I like. So let's talk about Languedoc in particular. So Languedoc is two things. First of all, 10 years ago, the Languedoc made a full third of France's wines, but it made less than 10% of its AOC wines. Now, I'm not going to cover French wine law in extreme depth, but effectively AOC wine law is these are the wines that are strictly controlled. When we say that Burgundy has to be Chardonnay for the whites and Pinot Noir from the reds, that's AOC. When we talk about Bordeaux reds being a blend of Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, Merlot, Malbec, Petit Verdot, and in a tiny concentration Carmenère, that's AOC law. Things like champagne having to be aged for 19 months in bottle before it's released, that's all AOC law. These are the premium wines of France. Languedoc for a very long time was known for Vin de Pays d'Oc, which were your Fortant de France or J.P. Chenet, and those wines still come from this region, by the way, but they're no longer the focus. These were your $11.95. You buy a French Sauvignon Blanc, and by Jove, it broadly tasted like a Sauvignon Blanc. They made a lot of very good everyday table wines, and to a certain point, they still do. The Languedoc is really a region of two different types of farmers. There are absolutely massive cooperatives that either buy from small farmers or in many cases these days own huge amounts of land and farm them themselves, and they're making French Merlot, French Cabernet, French, it won't even be labeled Syrah, it'll be labeled as Shiraz. A good example for this sort of thing is like the Fat Bastard wines. Really interesting wines in the sense that they are, they have a fat hippo on the label and they're called Fat Bastard. Are not interesting in any other particular capacity. The reason I call them interesting is actually the history of how they were sold, how they were marketed. Brands like Yellowtail and Apothic, the idea of marketing wine in a 21st century sense really owes all of its history and all of its provenance back to the Fat Bastard wines. Fascinating story. Actually, Terry O'Reilly on CBC, he has a program about advertising called Under the Influence. He actually has quite a good segment about the Fat Bastard wines and how they were marketed. Anyway, that's our first tangent of the evening. Let's talk about the region itself. So I talked about the first half, very large cooperatives that make broadly not desperately interesting but high quality wines. Let's talk about the small farmers, because this is very much the peasant farmer ideal in the south of France. We have these little tiny regions that a lot of people haven't heard of, and they tend to be owned by very small farms, and they tend to do everything in bush vines. So when we're talking about how we train our vines, you can train the vine to actually grow as like a small shrub, and it requires almost no maintenance. Or you can train it Guyot style, where you kind of have the vine coming up and then running along wires and then growing up the wires, and it creates much more production because you have much better training, and all of the grapes get light and they get air and they get water and they get everything else. But it's very maintenance heavy. A lot of these small farmers and small producers, they don't have the money to do Guyot training. So let's talk about kind of our major regions here, at least the ones that we're going to be talking about tonight. Our first wine will be coming from Picpoul de Pinet. That's right down here. The village is Pinet. The grape is Picpoul, which in French actually literally means lip stingers. So expect a very high acid white wine. Our second one will come from Limoux. This is predominantly a sparkling wine region based around the local grape Mosaic, as well as Chardonnay and Chenin Blanc. These guys have actually been making sparkling wines provably as anything can be based on really old historical documents, for about 125 years longer than the people in Champagne, which never fails to annoy the Champenoise. We have a wine from Corbière. And then finally, here is Costières de Nîmes. Our last wine is technically just outside the region. So we're going to flip over to a new page. So if you remember I said here's Costières de Nîmes, we're just on the other side of it. We're in the southern Rhone Valley. Here's the Rhone River. Here's all the famous stuff up in the north with Côte-Rôtie, Conzus, Château-Goyer, Hermitage is up there, and then, or probably Hermitage is up here. And then as we go down, here is Châteauneuf-du-Pape, here's Cornas, here's all the other bits. But we're going to go down here to Luberon, which is one of the, they listed as other wine-growing regions. It's actually much more interesting than that, and we'll get to why in a minute. So let's jump back to the Languedoc here. Very old region, been growing since Roman times, makes some absolutely fantastically interesting wines, and it's so much more than just acres and acres and acres of really boring $11 Chardonnay, and that's why I wanted to talk about it. So let's start with Picpoul de Pinet. Now for this one, I will admit I did take some notes just because this is a region that I don't get to talk about very often. This is one of my favorite parts of the world, but I would be honest, if you came in and asked me a really hard question about literally any of these wines tomorrow, you would be the first. This is a part of the world where we very often will sell the wines based on the incredible quality and very low price. In terms of price, this wine tasting ended up being $85 because I absolutely had to include the La Lumiere, which is $32. Everything else here is like $18.95, $19.95, $24.95. It was really this that drove up our price on this one. No to the Karen. I'm sorry, Karen Johnson. That's in my, continuing efforts to mock Aaron. I have hurt you, and that's not what I was really going for. I'm going to continue to mercilessly mock Aaron, but I'll try to do it in different ways.
Just using my name.
Yes, we'll just mock you mercilessly regardless. We do need to bring in some more Maturin. I agree. Maturin's a tough beast though, because Maturin, when you first get it, you tend to get it about 2-3 years old. So if I bought it today, it'd be a 2017 or maybe 2018. It's going to be undrinkable for 2 to 3 years. The Châteauvieux Maturin, which, thank you all so much. I was sitting on about a case and a half of the Maturin that we sell when we did that Vine Box tasting, and within about 5 days we were completely cleaned out of Maturin. What you guys aren't seeing in the background is I bought that Maturin in about 2015, and I sat on it for 2.5, 3 years before I ever put it on the shelf, just because I wanted it to be drinkable for people. I would have to buy new Maturin today, and then I'd have to sit on it for a couple of years to have it back on the shelf, because I'll be very honest, the Maturin that I would put on the shelf at only like a year to 2 years old, it wouldn't be something anyone would enjoy. So let's get on to a wine that I do very much enjoy. If you've come into the store in the last 18 months or so and you said, hey Kyle, I'd like a wine pairing, and I say, well, what are you having? And you say anything even tangentially related to shellfish, this is probably what I handed you. To my palate, Picpoul de Pinet is just the ultimate shellfish wine, and it's particularly best with oysters, but clams, mussels, lobster. Not so much with drawn butter, but I think you'll notice when this wine is, literally called lip stinger, you get the acidity. This wouldn't complement the lobster and drawn butter the way like a big fat oaky Chardonnay would, but it'll do the opposite. It would be like having an IPA with a lobster and drawn butter, which is actually an excellent pairing. This pierces through that butteriness and richness, and it refreshes the palate. This is lean, and it's mineral, and it's steely, and it's lemony. I wish more grapes like this were out there that are not, the only other wine to me that really drinks this way, well, there's two. A bone dry Riesling, yes, but we'll get into Riesling later. But this drinks to me very much like a Sauvignon Blanc without all the grapefruit and gooseberry and green pepper. It's lean and bracing and bright and very food friendly without having any of those harder to pair notes. Like that grapefruit thing's wonderful. I love Sauvignon Blanc a lot. But when you're trying to pair it with a dish, how do you pair something that it's grapefruit, and then it's more grapefruit, and then you slugs you in the face and pushes you down the stairs with grapefruit, and then there's also green pepper. It's a very big wine. It's a very wonderful wine, but it's not a wine that plays well with others. This wine has a lot of character. It's very delicious, but it's a wine that will happily pair with whatever you're putting it with, which I would recommend be shellfish. You could also do this with, actually a lot of salads would do nicely with this. I think this with like a salad with goat cheese could be very pretty. Yeah, sambuca prawns and lobster ravioli, and this would be absolutely lovely. Apples with tannins. I don't know if this has tannin. I think you're picking up tannin just because of how much acidity this has. And I'll just kind of refresh everyone here. Tannin doesn't come from grape juice. It doesn't come from seeds. Tannin exclusively in winemaking comes from grape skins. So if the wine doesn't have any skin contact, it should have very negligible amounts of tannins. Now, just the act of crushing and pressing grapes will release some tannins from the skins, but generally speaking, if we're talking about a wine that has tannin, it has seen some time on the skins, which will be kind of three categories. All red wines. I say with a roll of my eyes because I'm thinking, okay, well, Kyle, there's 3 examples that don't qualify. But broadly, all red wines, all orange wines, universally all orange wines. Orange wines are literally just whites aged on the skins. If there's a way to make an orange wine without aging it on the skins, it's not really an orange wine, so it doesn't count. And then finally, virtually all rosés. Of course, there are huge numbers of different ways to make a rosé, but most of them involve at least some skin contact, and as a result, they will generally have tannin. This certainly tastes like it has a touch of tannin to it, and I think that's just because, again, it's called lip smacker. It's got really, really high acidity. One interesting thing about Picpoul is it's a very, very old grape. Now, on its face, that doesn't sound very interesting. It's like, yes, it's an old grape. Grapes have been around forever. Muscat's the oldest. It's older than, like, the Common Era. It's been provably grown before the year 0. Why is this so interesting? It's old. It's because Picpoul's never really been commercially successful. It enjoyed kind of a brief fad in the Dutch winemaking, or in the Dutch wine industry in about the 1800s when it was blended with claret and served sweet. As we covered with the Riesling tasting, what makes a bad sweet wine versus a good sweet wine is really high acidity to carry off that higher sugar level. And for a very long time, the Dutch were really, really in love with a white blend of Claret and Picpoul from this region that they actually exported there. And it was one of its really only successes. Picpoul has always been a wine textbook sort of wine. You learn about it, like when you take formal wine education, you learn about the Languedoc, that you learn that Picpoul is a thing. But they don't taste you on it. They might taste you on, you know, Languedoc Roussillon Red, or they'll certainly taste you a Côte de Provence. You might get Port of Bandol, maybe a Cahors if you're really lucky, but you're not going to get Port of Picpoul very likely. It's kind of one of those things that's really for wine service staff, like at restaurants, absolutely love it because it's the perfect pairing, and Picpoul is never very expensive. I think the most expensive Picpoul on the shelf I've ever seen would have been about $23.95. But it's just always charming and it's always likable. It's like Pinot Gris that actually has some bloody acidity to it. I really like this grape. And yes, Craig, that is a little bit of a decision. After just how ridiculous 2 Wednesdays ago was, even if you're not a beer fan, do watch the beer tasting from 2 weeks ago. Ignore all of the commentary for the first 3 beers, and then watch absolutely everything come off the rail on the 4th. It's good viewing. That is, I want that video on my headstone, assuming video headstones are a real thing in 30 years or whatever.
Video headstones.
Don't laugh, it'll be solar powered. We'll have a video of that on loop.
Like looking at the back of it.
And everyone will universally say, I'm glad he's dead. So, yes. Let's get on to our second wine, Blanquette de Limoux. So when we were talking about the traditional Languedoc-Roussillon, Limoux is in the far west. Let's jump back to the map here for a moment. Making Aaron stand up and wind his way over here.
There we go.
It's our very high-tech studio. So here's where we were before, in Picpoul de Pinet. Narbonne is kind of considered the heart of the region, or at least the middle. And then Limoux is up here. I actually have no idea what Cabardes is. I've never seen a wine for that. I know Minervois, I know Corbière, I know Fitou. I've had a Maury, couldn't tell you the first thing about it. I've had broadly everything here. I have no idea what Cabardes is. That'll be a thing for me to learn after the tasting. But yeah, interesting. So Limoux are hills, and they are hills with, I do believe, the oldest provable sparkling wine industry, at least deliberate sparkling wine industry on earth. Now, the Blanquette de Limoux that we're tasting today, as well as Crémant de Limoux, they are made by the Champagne method. So the wine is fermented completely dry. It is very often barrel aged. And then after the wine is completely finished, it is put into a bottle and allowed to cellar with a little bit of sugar, the vin de Thierry. And the wine is allowed to very gently recarbonate in bottle. And then the wine is burst. They take the last bit of yeast out, which is called tirage, and they top it up with a little bit more wine to set the sweetness. So if you've ever had a wine that is absolutely bone dry or brut, they are adding virtually no sugar to it at the dosage, and then you will have, you know, the increasing sweetnesses of extra dry, sec, demi-sec, milieu. That will purely be on the sweetness of the final wine they add to top up the bottle. Now that was a really cheap and dirty, like, you know, glossing over of the traditional Champagne method, but we've covered that before. I want to talk about kind of the more interesting thing about Blanquette de Limoux is that it wasn't always done this way. There are still Limoux wines. I've never seen one in Alberta, but I'm always on the lookout. They have Blanquette de Limoux Méthode Ancestrale. It's the original way that they made these sparkling wines. It's a modification of what we now consider the Pétnat method, where the wine is put in the bottle partially fermented and allowed to re-ferment in bottle. Now, if you remember talking to Ryan Sturm, I believe he called Pétnat a, quote, complete bastard to make because they are incredibly difficult. You get up completely covered in wine. The bottles always run a risk of exploding. If you get it wrong, just the tiniest bit in either direction, you end up with bottles that are basically hand grenades, or you end up with wine that doesn't carbonate at all. But yeah, they do have these cloudy, yeasty, lightly fizzy pet nats from this region, and they're the oldest pet nats in the world. And I've never actually had a chance to try one, and I'm always on the lookout for one because this is the region that I really would like to try one from. Now this is our in-house Limoux producer. These guys make the Blanquette de Limoux. They make a Cremant de Limoux, which is Chardonnay and Chenin Blanc. Blanquette by law must be 15% Mauzac. This is Chardonnay with Mauzac. I don't have the percentages and I couldn't find them anywhere online. So I'm going to guess at 60-40 because that's usually about what a good producer does. And then there is also a Cremant de Limoux Rosé, which in this case is Pinot Noir. The cork did hit the ceiling and then the dog is now emotionally damaged. Well, you know, aren't we all really? I do feel bad for the dog. Not if it's the dog that bit Nigel. That dog can suck it. But, you know, sorry, for everyone else who's not me and Craig, Nigel did a home delivery and Craig's dog bit Nigel. So if it's that dog, then I don't feel bad. But yes, this is our Blanquette de Limoux, the original sparkling wine, deliberately done as a sparkling wine in France. It's a really, really pretty, interesting champagne-styled wine that if you smell it, I get biscuits, I get pears, I get apples, I can only call it autolytic now, so it comes from the dyeing yeast, which is called autolysis, and it comes off as this brioche, almost beeswaxy character that is very, very typical of wines done in champagne style. Now, I'll preface this by saying we sell this for $19.95. I'm pretty sure the least expensive champagne we sell in the entire store is now $52.95. I like this quite a lot better than the least expensive champagne in the store. That $32 upcharge on what is, in a vacuum, probably quite bad wine from Champagne and quite good from Limoux is entirely because one says champagne on the label. And this is when I say there's a lot of bullshit and stupidity in branding in wine. It's entirely true, and this is kind of an example of what that is. Limoux's been doing it longer. They've been doing it better. Not better. They've been doing it as well, at least on a consumer grade. I would say I've never had a Limoux wine that absolutely set my hair on fire. There are some higher end champagnes, particularly Comte de Champagne by Taittinger, which I don't actually sell because I've tried and failed selling it down here. But there are some truly exceptional champagnes out there. I've never had a Limoux that just blew my mind. But at least for like the everyday stuff, I'd rather pay $20 for that and have 2.5 of those for a bottle of Moe or Veuve or something similar. I don't find consumer grade champagne desperately interesting. And I'm sure Guinness was a good dog having a bad day. I was just kind of busting your chops there, Craig. So we've been through our first two wines and we've tasted kind of a light, fresh, bright white that I really enjoy for under $20. We've tasted, again, under $20, really spectacularly interesting champagne-styled wine. I'm actually going to put the closure back on that so it actually keeps its fizz. Let's jump into the reds a little bit. Now, the reds in the Languedoc are even more of a mixed bag than the whites. This is a part of the world where there are all of the traditional South French varieties. And I won't get into all of them, but they are everything from Picpoul, there's Marsan down here, there's Roussillon. There are all of the Spanish cava grapes in Macabeu, Xarel·lo, and Parellada. They're generally using their French names for the same things, but they're all down here because this is very, very close. I mean, if we just kind of, on the map, jump 3 inches to my right, your left, we'll be into Spain. This is a part of the world where a lot of native varieties and native traditions in this part of the world, they've survived and they continue to make really interesting wines. There's a ton of Verdicchio here. There's quite a lot of what we now call Verdelho. There's Marsan, Roussillon, Grenache Blanc, Faux Blanc. There's so many interesting things in this part of the world. And then on the other side, there's just tracts and tracts and tracts of the world's most boring and soulless Chardonnay and Sauvignon Blanc and Rosé. Not that rosés are great, but you know what I mean. On the red side, it's perhaps even more complicated because not only has this been, you know, one of the last holdouts for some of the more rustic grapes like Cinsault or Carignan, but it also is a test bed. This was a part of the world that was considered relatively easy to grow grapes in, so if you were a big famous winemaker from Bordeaux or the Loire Valley or Burgundy or wherever, you might buy a hectare and just try out like a test planting of a bunch of different things. So when we get to our first red here, the Mariole, this is Carignan, yes. Good grape variety, a lot of provenance. You see it, it's part of the Chateauneuf de Pape blend. We see it in the Ventoux, we see it all through the southern Rhone. We see it absolutely everywhere throughout the Languedoc-Roussillon region. But it's blended with Marcelin, which is a 1961 crossing, which might be the youngest grape we've ever tasted on the channel. And it's a crossing of Spanish Garnacha with Cabernet Sauvignon. It's a grape that is starting to win a lot of acclaim. This is something I touched on when I did the preview video for this tasting. We are going to hear a lot more from Marcelin because Marcelin is thought to have incredible potential in China, and China is spending an absolute king's ransom in developing the wine industry. Right now, we're not seeing anything yet. But you think about China, you think about how much land they have, and yes, a lot of it's, you know, frozen hellscape up by Mongolia where nothing would realistically grow, but it stretches all the way down from, you know, the borders of like Thailand and northern India right up to that area. Like, it's all rocky river valleys and deltas, and it's perfect wine country. There's no reason China couldn't make absolutely stunning wine. And one of the red grapes they've really hitched their wagon to for the future of the wine industry is Marcelin. So let's get into that next. If the cork hit the ceiling, I wonder if the camera would actually pick up our champagne scar on the ceiling.
Well, I certainly could try.
You can try?
Yeah.
So Diana Anatoli, who is a wine rep who unfortunately now I think is no longer repping wine, or at least has closed her own agency. She actually brought in a bottle of sparkling wine for us years and years ago, and we still have the scar on our ceiling of where her cork hit the ceiling so hard it literally left the dent. So yes, the way I look at that is, if you didn't end up with wine absolutely everywhere, if you didn't have to open the bottle in a bucket because it foamed everywhere, if the cork hit the ceiling, that's better than the wine being flat. So really, you can stop drinking sparkling wine, or you could invest in a stronger ceiling. I'd rather go with a stronger ceiling. I almost got that out with a straight face.
Well,
And yes, China already produces the most Chardonnay in the world. Yes, I'd heard that. No, we are probably not today, probably not tomorrow, but maybe as soon as 5 to 8 years from now, we are going to have like a full-on proper large Chinese section, at least as large as our Portuguese section, which right now is about 12 wines. And I'll bet by the time I'm ready to retire from the wine business, which will I ever really retire? Probably not. But let's just theoretically say I was going to do that at 65. I would bet that I would have a section as large as at least Spain in the store devoted to China. The amount of money that they're throwing at it, the amount of expertise they're pulling out of France. So if you're a really spectacularly famous winemaker in France or wherever in like Western Europe, China right now will basically pay you to come and hang out on one of their wine estates and be there for a vintage and just pass on knowledge. They are spending an absolute fortune developing an absolutely world-class wine industry, and when it comes out, it's going to be quite something. Okay, let's talk about Le Mariole. This is from Corbière. Aaron, are you ready for our map time?
ready.
All right. God, we're nerds. So we are here in Corbière, which an obvious look will say, yes, this is the largest region in the Languedoc-Roussillon. You will see a lot of stuff that's just IGP Languedoc, or you will see a lot of things that are just Corbière. But this is a huge area. This is an absolutely massive amount of land, and as a result, you end up with a lot of variability. There are hillsides, there are plains. This is one of those wine regions that 20, 30 years from now, we could see this being micro cut up into little tiny regions. You know, we could see Lesignan Corbière be like the premier region. You can't buy wine for less than $40 from there. I have no idea if that's a good or bad area, but I'm just saying this is a wine region on the cusp. This would be like labeling Olive Rhone, whether it was Châteauneuf du Pape or Saint Joseph or Hermitage, as Rhone Valley. This is going to be something very interesting at Corbière. Let's start with this. So, this is Le Mariole, which has perhaps the most unassuming bloody wine label in the shop. It's just a really badly drawn jester with some hedge clippers walking over a no badgers sign. Why is it a no bad? That is a no badgers sign, right?
No badgers?
No badgers?
What sign? I don't see the damn sign. Oh yeah, that is a no badgers.
That is no badgers.
Wind in the willows.
All right. Is that a Wind in the Willows reference?
I don't know if it is or not.
Okay, I was going to say
Badger on any
badgers. Sure, badgers for days. But I don't know. It's a very, unassuming label. And it's Carignan Marcelin, which is not a blend I would think of as being desperately interesting. And it doesn't come from big estates. This is Javier Ledogar, who makes like 5 wines in the whole world, and we carry 4 of them. It doesn't look like it would be serious wine, and it doesn't come from a desperately serious region. But the wine here, with its blueberries and its Easter lilies and its violets, and yeah, plums, but for me, this wine, it's the Easter lilies. It's so damned floral. And those florals to me bleed into vanilla and then into blueberry, and it makes me think of like blueberry danishes. There's definitely some fruit leather, or fruit leather is just a really nice term for like fruit roll-ups. It definitely has that, and it's just an absolute delight. This to me is one of those perfect fall reds. If it's a warm evening, you can chill this very lightly, serve it on the back deck. If it's a cold evening, serve it at room temperature, huddle under a blanket with a good book, say, F the world, I'm just going to drink red wine and pretend that it's not snowing in mid-September like it bloody did last year. The children's lit scholar said it is not a Wind in the Willows reference. Thank you, everyone who's not Aaron.
You're welcome. I didn't think it was a reference.
Uh-huh.
It just reminded me, referred my brain. Thanks.
Smells in your face. It is a showy wine. Now mine has been open for, I opened these about 10 to. Mine's been open about 45 minutes. But yes, it's very big. It's very big and it's very punchy, and you get in the mouth, the alcohol's not over the top. And this is something I do want to touch on and actually spend a minute talking about. We're down here on the Mediterranean. When you take classical wine education and we talk about climate, the hottest one is the Mediterranean climate. Very short winters, very dry in summer, intense winds coming off of the ocean, baking heat. Rather than planting, if you're in a very wet part of the world or temperate part of the world, you tend to plant your vines closer together so that none of the vines get enough water that they'll make overly water-fat grapes. In this part of the world, you tend to be doing the opposite. You tend to be planting the vines further apart so they won't water starve and die. This is a place where it's very, very easy for your wines to come out at 14.5, 15, even 15.5% alcohol. To make a wine like this at 13, it takes a very, very delicate touch. And that's why I like this wine with its stupid No Badgers label that is not a Wind in the Willows reference, Aaron, and is just silly and fun and lighthearted. And, it just says it's Old Vines, 2018. Put in the bottle by the brothers Ledogar. Javier and his brother, Javier too. And yeah, I mean, it's just one of those really pretty interesting wines that I just genuinely enjoy drinking. I'm almost surprised with this that it's actually vintaged. Wines that are made in this style with this incredible focus on quality, but not a focus on seriousness, they'll very often not vintage the wines. So they'll take, 2017 was really hot, so we got a lot of alcohol and extraction, but 2018 was really rainy, so the wines were very thin. not actually the climatic conditions in southern France, so please don't email me. I'm just using examples. But if we blend them together, we come up with a wine that's better than both. Very often with wines like this, you'll see this. I'm surprised to actually see a vintage on this wine, because the style with this type of winemaking very often will be to go with a multi-year blend, just because it can create even more interesting wines if we are not taking it seriously. But while the label isn't serious, this is again a natural wine. So this is a vineyard where, you know, they plow the vineyard with horses and fertilize with horse manure only when the horses are plowing. They release wild donkeys into the vineyard to eat up the weeds. There's a lot of very serious winemaking going into this wine, serious quality control and tradition, from an area that, you know, when we opened talking about, we were talking about vast acres of $11 Chardonnay. It's kind of nice to see other things happening here. And this is the future of the Languedoc-Roussillon. We're also seeing a lot of, for two reasons. We're seeing a lot of really small, interesting winemaking projects come out of here for two reasons. The first being there's a very, very strong tradition here, and France is a very traditional winemaking country. If this is a part of the world where everything is co-ops, and you finish making your wine, good luck finding a trucking company to help you, a bottling company, someone who will sell you corks, someone anything. This is a co-op part of the world. There is no support for an independent grower. That's starting to change in the 21st century, but it's very much like if you try to start as a new producer in Burgundy, like they'll put sugar in your gas tank. Like it's a very cutthroat, very closed community. The southern Languedoc isn't. It's very much the ideal of the peasant farmer, the small producer who is just doing their best, and in a great year might make their own wines, and in a bad year, well, there's the co-op, and they don't pay a lot, but they'll pay you something for your grapes. And as a result, we see a lot of really ambitious and really interesting winemaking projects come out of this part of the world because the startup costs are so low. And that's the second reason. If you are able to actually, you know, you or I, standing here, you know, in southern Alberta, even if we won a big, like, Max Millions lottery tomorrow, we couldn't start in Bordeaux or Burgundy or the Rhone. The land costs and the everything costs are just far too high. If, you know, your dream was to wear a terrible, you know, vest and have a gnarled walking stick and walk around your vines, that's how you want to spend your millions with starting your own French winery, this is probably one of the 6 or 8 regions in France where you could really do that. You can make absolutely fantastic wines in this part of the world without spending, you know, literally like Elon Musk sort of money. There's some sediment in the bottle near the cork. Well, there should be. So sediment in the bottle will come from 3 different places. First off is far more common in whites and sparkling wines and a little bit in rosés. That's called wine diamonds or tartaric acid. This is exactly the same thing as cream of tartar you might find in your baking cupboard. Tartaric acid will occasionally, as the wine ages, become oversaturated in the solution and crystallize and drop out. It's just really tart if you get it on your tongue. It's an acid in crystal form. It's going to be sour. They're absolutely harmless. It's a very old, but it's actually a northern French tradition, that if you get wine diamonds or these tartaric crystals in your New Year's champagne, that it bodes for a good new year. So that's fun. The second is tannic acid. I say as I touch a white wine after having to explain why white wines don't have tannic acid. Let's use a red. If you have a red wine, the preservative effect in red wine is tannic acid. It comes from the grape skins, and when it drops out over time, it very gently oxidizes in the bottle, and it leaves behind a crusty sediment. And it will very often stick to the sides of the bottle. It's one of the reasons people recommend that you rotate your bottle when you're cellaring it, is so that all the sediment doesn't build up on one side. The last one is far more common with natural wines. They're simply unfiltered. They don't add egg white or fish bladders or bull's blood or anything to fine the wines. They don't filter the wines. The wines are very alive in the bottle. They don't laugh. I hear you snickering, girls. You don't snicker at me. It's a very, I don't know. I don't know. That's terrible. But yeah. I've completely lost thought. Sorry, that was funnier here than it was probably for you. But yes, it wasn't funny here either. Thanks, Mike. But yes, with the natural wines, they're not fine, they're not filtered, they're not mucked with in particular, so they will actually throw a bit of sediment. And very often that will be little bits of leftover yeast. It will be little tiny bits of grape skin or grape seed, or maybe even grape stem if it's a whole bunch ferment. No, you'll always get a little bit of sediment with completely unfiltered wines. Now let's read the comments after that. This is going to be good. Hated the first taste, loved the third.
Huh. Smells like the field.
Smells in your face, tastes sexy, it's floral, it's great. Mine was fizzy. Yes, so this comes back to the natural wine thing. There's two reasons for a wine to be fizzy. One, we will find, if you're here very early on, I think it was week 3, we did our German whites tasting. We talked about SO2 additions. So sulfur dioxide is kind of treated as the wonder drug in non-natural, non-organic, even in organic, but not natural winemaking, because it will kill bacteria, it will kill fungus, and it will absorb oxygen. So for making a white wine at, let's just say 1895, like this one, and it has to go all the way across the Atlantic on a container ship, and you're worried about it, experiencing heat or cold or bacterial infection or oxidation or whatever. If you hit it with a little SO2, it will probably be a little bit fizzy when you first open it. It'll have some pétillance, but the wine will be safe. The other reason you'll see it is the wine is bottled still alive with a little bit of residual sugar, a little bit of still alive yeast, and the wine will develop a little tiny touch of pétillance. It will not be on most of the wines. Mine actually did have just a touch when I first opened it. Like I said, I opened these at about 1:45 and tasted them just to make sure that I didn't get to the fourth wine and the fourth one was corked, and I had to send Aaron rooting around, find a new bottle and open it and do that all on camera. I taste them in advance for that reason. But mine has had a chance to settle down and open up. But yes, if you get some initial sparkle, that's because the wine is still alive. Then we get immediately the question, ours isn't at all, what causes the difference? Well, I just answered that. Sediment smells like the field. I'm going to assume that means it smells lightly fecund. Get in their hand, just pour your own. I'm on a roll. Probably terribly, but so what causes these potentially slightly fecund or horse manure-y sort of aromas in some of the natural wines? That's called reduction, and broadly it is what happens when you ferment a wine without the presence of oxygen, or in some cases if you just age a wine without the presence of oxygen. If you're trying to make a very fresh and fizzy and light and fluffy wine like a Beaujolais Nouveau or like a certain class of Australian Shirazes or California Cabernets, you actually introduce an oxygen bubbler, yes, like you'd see in a fish tank in the wine, to prevent that reductive character. Or after the wine has finished fermenting, you'd actually open up the fermenter and let oxygen in and let that reductive character blow off. But if you do that, some of those really delicate characteristics, which in this case I would say is probably the blueberry, it would just disappear. Once oxygen's in and those characters oxidize, they're gone. They're not coming back. You can't get them back by leaving the wine open for a couple of days, just introducing more oxygen. So when we have reductive aromas, they tend to be, they tend to blow off fairly quickly, but when they blow off, they reveal the other pretty things that they were hiding. Absolutely perfect, flawless winemaking, which no one on earth is capable of, I don't care how good you are, you will be able to get all of the pretty oxygen-free characteristics without any of the reductive ones. And every winemaker in 100 batches gets crazy lucky and just gets that. But as like a rule, it's not possible. If you want those pretty blueberry and violet and lilac notes, you kind of have to deal with the funky ones when you first open the bottle. They do tend to blow off fairly quickly though. Don't pick stocks. Yes, timeshares. Timeshares are clearly the way to make all the money. Scotch and wine don't mix. Well, don't mix scotch and wine then, Cass. Bloody hell. So that gets us through our first three. So quickly talk about what we have coming up next Wednesday. We are now doing our wine tastings bi-weekly. and that's purely based on sales. So we get back to the point where we're selling, 3 to 4 cases a week of wine on all of the wine tastings. We'll be right back to doing weekly. So do tell your friends. But right now we're only selling about 18, 19 a week of these, so I'm doing them every other week. For next week, for the beer tasting, which are remaining weekly, we are doing Guava Week. So it appears that perhaps the Canadian fruit puree seller to every brewery in Western Canada had a big sale on guava this year, and everyone and their mum made a bloody guava beer. So Snake Lake, Establishment, Cabin, and Zero Issue. Now, if you're saying, wow, those sound like some of the coolest breweries in Alberta, you're right. These are absolutely kick-ass breweries, and they made some really interesting, fascinating guava beers. So we have a guava spritzer IPA. We have a pink guava Catharina sour, which is a South American sour style. We have a pink popper, which is a guava and hot pepper, New England IPA. And finally a strawberry and guava sour from Zero Issue. So we have some really neat beers made with guava, and I will be choosing the topic for the wine tasting next week. If you have any, and yes, do watch the promo for this one. Aaron is rightly so very, very proud of the promo for the wine tasting this week. No, it's better than okay. It's quite good. It's very funny. You've sent a satellite image to help the maps check my messages. Aaron, are you still logged into my Facebook? Can you get that?
Oh. What does Craig want?
He sent a satellite image to help the, it's probably a Rickroll knowing Craig, but,
I can find out. Let's see if we can make it work.
Is there still a plan for Scotch tastings? Yes, there is. I've been having a lot of really intense conversations with Lee Hansen, with the folks at, I'm just going to call them Diageo because I can't remember what they're calling their company this week. It's changed like 6 times in 5 years, but effectively Diageo. I've talked to Jonathan Bray, I've talked to Andy Dunn via email. We have a plan for Scotch tastings. It is probably going to be on the weeks when we are not doing a wine tasting. We are going to do a whiskey chat sort of experience. We'll put the whiskeys on for like a couple of $3 above cost. Basically, if somebody comes in with a SAG card, it gets them 10% off. I just need to make sure I don't go below 10, like below cost on the items. So expect Scotch it effectively 11% above cost. We're going to put the whiskeys that we're tasting that week on sale. We're going to talk them up. We're going to do that so you have the opportunity to buy them, but they will not be exclusively designed that you should have them in front of you like the way the wine and beer tastings are. I won't specifically say, so since you're tasting along with us, you should taste. I'll talk about them in a little more general terms, and we will try to have the actual distillery owners or people very intimately involved with the whiskey making program joining us. I wanted to do something, but I assume most of you have been in the space we're in now. It is much larger than it used to be when it was an absolute closet filled with wine that was a former bathroom. Now it's 2 former bathrooms, so it's twice as large. It's not a big space. We could not do Scotch tasting in any reasonable way and do it safely and responsibly. So Devin and I, we talked about that for the better part of 6 weeks over the summer, and we finally said, you know what? It's not possible. I'm not comfortable doing it. We're pulling the plug. So we're just doing this. Just tell us the scotches. Well, I would if I knew them. I'll tell you the people that I am talking to. I'm talking to Jonathan of Secret Spirits. So expect Secret Spirits, maybe some Weems, maybe some... apparently this is another one of those weeks from my memory. The other whiskey brands that Jonathan represents. From Lee Hansen, you should expect some Tom and Towel, probably some Old Malt Cask. They're relaunching Hepburn's Choice with slightly different packaging. We're going to see some different stuff from them. I'm hoping that Diageo will have somebody to join us right from Scotland. I'm holding out for like maybe a PT Diageo week with like Kalila and Lagavulin and Talisker, where we'd get some of their more interesting stuff and have someone right from Lagavulin. Who, if you've known me long enough, is the person that I stood up at Lagavulin Distillery years and years and years ago because I missed a flight. Other than that, Andy Dunn, I've only had a brief conversation saying, would you like to do this? He said yes, and that's where we left it. And then I'm talking to the folks at Glenfarclas about doing something as well. So can I tell you exactly what we're doing? No, I can't. But it is a work in process. We're working on it. Thank you, Craig. It was a very contentious issue, and none of us were sure what we should do, but we wanted to come up with something interesting. Okay, so let us get into our final wine. Have Craig's examples of wines on a line versus ones alone? I don't know what that means, but I will say yes.
This is what Craig sent us.
Okay.
And it's a nice example of like you were talking about something.
Sorry. The image you sent is from the area that we're tasting as both vines that are trained and those that are not. Thank you, Craig.
Yeah,
it's a much better explanation than bloody Aaron gave.
Jesus.
Just, yeah, why do you come here, Aaron? We just do nothing but be mean to you.
Where the hell is the thing? I'll show the people.
Yeah, do show the people, because I'll see it about 10 seconds later.
Oh, there it is. Okay.
You're going to have to wait for your comments, because I get this about 10 seconds after you do.
Okay, it's coming here. So this is vines on a line versus the ones that's like standalone. They're seeing that right now.
Okay. So there are two classic ways of training vines. One is the Guyot method, which is to train the vines onto a pair of wires. So the vine base comes out of the ground, and then you split it into two, and they both run along the lower wire, and you tie them to that wire. That's very often your permanent wood stock, and that will actually stay year after year. And then every summer, that is a picture of a field from space. But
what he said.
I don't know. You'll have the vines themselves. So you have this. I have a book with pictures of everything. Why don't we just show people Guyot versus? I assume this is going to have a diagram, because why would you explain Guyot training and not have a bloody diagram? Yes, they do, as it happens. Here we are. This is Guyot training. So here is the vine. It comes out of the ground. In winter, you will cut it back to this final cane. And there may be, this would be single Guyot. In double Guyot, there would be another one coming out the other side. Every spring, it grows up these canes, these additional little stalks. These are what grow your grapes. Come fall, they cut it back to the base cane again. Bush vine training, I'm less confident there will actually be a diagram of that, because it does not, because it's a vine that looks like a bush. You've seen a bush, you've seen bush training. It's basically allowing the vine to grow in a very compact kind of small, it's a bush. You've seen a bush. It's bush training. The description's in the name. But yes, that's the difference between traditional Guyot training and bush training. Bush training is really good because it will retain water more naturally, because that shape will create shade in the center of the vine, where the soil will stay moister. And then finally, the Guyot training is much, much better for areas where you experience a lot of mold and rot, because those long, thin canes of vine, they'll allow a lot more air transfer. So traditionally, you'll see more bush training in very, very dry areas where you're trying to maximize moisture, whereas Guyot training is better in very, very wet areas where you're trying to minimize rot and mold. Nice butt joke, Craig. Thank you. Let's talk about the last wine, the one that I liked so well that I actually had to include it to create this tasting around it. I will say, having it right after the Mariole, does anybody else feel like the Mariole is actually showier? I still think this is a better wine. It's a little more serious. I'm so glad that, Hand and Aaron over here are having a magnificent time, because they haven't stopped laughing for the last 10 minutes. But, I kind of think the Mariole is more fun. This is better, but Okay, there's a lot to like here too. Here it's not just blueberry, blackberry. Here you get blueberry, blackberry, I get plum, I get richness, I get depth, I get the oak.
It's nice.
This just has so many layers, and I get mineral, and I get wet stones, and I get limestone into granite. I can taste the soil the grapes are grown on, and I love that so much. That terroir character is something that we really lose with heavily mechanized or heavily, I really like the term mucked with because it's YouTube safe, but really heavily fucked with wines. They've been artificially acidified or late harvested at a 16% potential alcohol and then vacuum distilled so they weren't super boozy. They've had artificial sugars added. They've had oak chips. They've just been so heavily altered. They don't resemble anything what they entered the winery coming into. You know, with this, you can tell where it was grown. You can tell how good the season was up to the point, in the sense that we know they didn't heavily alter it. So if the wine tastes good, the season wasn't garbage. It's just a lovely, very natural, very organic sort of experience that I hate the word holistic so much, but it feels like a holistic impression of the place where it was grown, and I really appreciate that about it. The Mariole is just showy as heck. This is a little more serious. This isn't designed to age, it's designed to just be fun. This is a little more serious, and I really respect it for that.
Cool. Dig it.
I do want to talk briefly about where this comes from. We did talk about this at the very start, but I know that our viewership numbers at the start and our viewership numbers at the end are quite different. So here is our Languedoc Roussillon. They're actually higher. Don't you snicker at me. So this is the region we were talking about. Here's our first one with Picpoul de Pinet. Here's our sparkling wine from Limoux. Here is the Mariole from Corbière. And here's Costières-Nîmes, but our wine doesn't actually come from Costières-Nîmes. It comes from about where the spine of the book is. We're just going to flip the page here, and we're going to go over to the Southern Rhone Valley. It's this little arrow is pointing at Costières-Nîmes, and it's really just off the page. This wine comes from this Luberon area in the extreme south. This was wine that would have been not even like AOC Rhone Valley or AC Rhone Valley. This is really kind of the bleeding edge. This might be an example. I haven't got 100% confirmation on this. This might be a little bit of a climate change region. This wasn't a part of the world that was really great for grapes before climate change happened, but has gotten a lot more notice and a lot more quality. And it might simply be that perhaps Luberon was really rainy before, and now it's a lot drier, so the vines actually don't get overwatered and can produce higher quality wines. Climate change operates in different ways. It's not just, extreme weather and, rising temperatures. It's changes in precipitation patterns and changes in winds and changes in everything. And Luberon, for whatever reason, has really been having a bit of a minute the last 10 years. So, yeah, it's... Shut up. I get so much sass, it's wonderful. I'm never alone for these. I'm never uncriticized. It's wonderful. Much stronger tannins, a much more serious wine. The Mariole is very charming and very likable and very not serious. I find this much more serious. Ooh, we're into the rankings portion. Ooh, bloody hell, where do I put these? Hans says 4312. I am struggling with this. This was the wine that I loved so much that I had to build a tasting around it, and it's going to finish third.
Holy shit.
3, 1, 4, 2 for me. That's a heck of a lineup. And this is, I hope, change some people's minds about the wines of Val de Pays d'Oc. This is the south of France. This is where you get your $11 Chardonnay. This is where you get your really, really bad commercially grown Cabernet. This is where you get Fat Bastard or Old Fart or Mommy's Timeout Pinot Grigio. Yes, they get the fruit for that from Northern Italy, but this is a lot of those terrible, awful joke label wines. They came out of this region. And wines like Apothic Red, wines like Yellowtail, they got their business model of going into a wine region where the wine industry is experiencing what we call a wine lake. Broadly, they have much more wine already made sitting in tanks than they actually can sell. So as a result, they have to do something with it. And when Languedoc was sitting on way too much wine in the very early 2000s and late 90s, they turned that into Fat Bastard. And they made an absolutely magnificent amount of money. Fat Bastard made just all the money when it was new. And then it created a whole bunch of really bad pretenders like Old Fart Wines, which I think, when I first started here, and I want to be very clear, this is when my dad owned the store. We carried the full range of Old Fart Wines, and they all had uniquely terrible, awful, ageist labels. And then that idea of, well, this region in the world is experiencing a glut of wine. It's good wine, but you can have it for absolute pennies on the dollar as long as you just truck it away, because they have grapes waiting to go into these tanks to be made into wine. That's where Yellowtail came from, and that's to a certain point where Apothic and Barefoot came from. The idea of wine not necessarily having a country, the idea of, Layer Cake is quite known for this, where they're Malbecs from Argentina and they're Chardonnays from California and they're Cabernet Sauvignon, if they presumably have one, maybe it comes from Spain. The idea of having a wine brand but not having any vineyards or necessarily even a winery, and I'm fully aware that Apothic Red is made at the Gallo Central facility. The idea of buying one in the bulk market, already made, but having a well-established brand, that comes out of the Languedoc 20-25 years ago. Kind of the worst examples of corporate wine. They get the roots here, but the region's capable of so much more than that. It's not just a footnote of, oh, you like Yellowtail and Barefoot? Well, we know who to blame, the bloody Languedoc. It's got so much more to offer, and I really love this very complicated, and we've just scraped the surface. All of those little tiny subregions, they all have something to offer. Except for the one whose name I didn't know and didn't recognize. It's probably terrible because I never had it. But no, this whole area, it has so much more to give, and I really enjoy it for that. Oh, and 3 was undrinkable for a couple of folks. Yeah. Dean and Kevin, do bring in your bottles. I do want to taste them, and I will replace them in either event, but I just want to see. I want to see what was going on with it, because I'm always curious. Because if there's a run of bad wines with the Mariole, we might just take the 2018 off the shelf. As charming as it was for me and for some other folks, maybe the 2018 is just a year that's inconsistent. We should just pull it off the shelf, put the last couple bottles in the clearance rack, and wait till 2019. It's good information to have. So if you'll bring it down, I do want to taste it, and we'll give you a new bottle and hope that it was just a one-off. Now, be aware that I opened my Mariole about 45 minutes before I assume a lot of you did. I opened it about 15 minutes before the tasting even started. If you were opening that as I got to it, you and I got very different wines. And I will say that the Mariole that I tasted when it was first fresh was very different from what I actually tasted on the channel here. So if you're still very curious what the heck I had in my glass, give it about another 10, 15, and then go back to it. And if you're still unhappy, just bring it back and we'll replace it with either one of the same, or we'll replace it with something completely different, just of the same value. Up to you. Any questions?
Horse smells.
Oh, yeah, horse smells, if that makes sense. No, that's totally fair. You know what? They can't all be winners, and I will still say this is better than that god-awful all the things stout. So I liked it anyway, and I couldn't force that other shit down my throat. So that is the 2 prescribed swear words we're allowed on YouTube. Yeah. All right. I think we'll wrap it up there, Aaron. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Hand.
You're welcome.
Thank you to all of you for joining us. This was an absolute delight to talk about. I hope that you learned something, and I hope that you enjoyed the wines. At least 3 out of the 4. We'll just hide this. I hope you enjoyed the wines. So yes, that was our exploration of the Languedoc-Roussillon region. If you have suggestions for the next wine tasting, you can reach out to us on any of our social media, because I haven't given a single moment's thought to it because I've been working on bloody year end. So if you have a great idea that's been burning in your head and you said, you know what, Kyle really needs to do this, tell me. We got 2 weeks to put that together, and I would be happy to do that for you.
Chinese wines.
No, we can't do those yet because the good ones aren't here yet.
How to write wines. How to write wine.
There will never be a good one of those. The suggestions were China and how to write wines, which are, the good ones aren't here yet, and there's never been a good one. So, yes. Thank you all very much. Thank you for a wonderful Friday night. This was a lot of fun. I hope you learned something. I'm going to go kill Mike, I think. Have a good night, everyone. Good night.